A forgotten language waits in the dark. Elara, a linguist obsessed with lost tongues, stands before the sealed entrance of the Sunken Temple of Aethel. She ignores her mentor's dire warnings, clutching a fragment of a map that promises the key to the legendary Whispering Stones. Her entire academic future and personal safety are on the line, all to prove her late grandmother's theories were not just a myth. By the end of this journey, you will understand how a single whisper from the past can reshape our entire future. As Elara forces the ancient door open and steps across the threshold, the air itself seems to shift and stir around her. Something that should have remained asleep has begun to awaken. Where are you listening from right now, and what does the sky look like outside your window? What would you risk to uncover a truth the world has tried to erase? The stone felt unnaturally warm beneath her palm. As Elara traced the intricate glyphs, the monolith answered with a deep, resonant hum that traveled up her arm and settled in her teeth. She was so focused on memorizing the patterns, on feeling the ancient grooves, that she did not notice the floor shift. A heavy slab of rock groaned and slammed down, sealing the entrance and plunging the chamber into near darkness. Her only light now was the weak beam of her headlamp, dancing across walls that felt suddenly much closer. The air grew still and heavy. Panic clawed at her throat, a primal urge to scream and beat her fists against the unyielding stone. But then she remembered her grandmother's journals, filled with sketches of these very glyphs and a single, underlined phrase: "The path is forward, never back." Taking a shaky breath, Elara made her choice. She turned away from the sealed door and faced the only other opening, a dark archway leading deeper into the earth. The low hum of the monolith seemed to follow her, mingling now with something else, a susurrus of faint, layered voices that brushed against the edge of her hearing. The stones were not just humming, they were whispering, and as she stepped into the tunnel, a subtle scraping sound echoed from the darkness behind her, a reminder that in this place, nothing is ever truly forgotten. The whispering voices seemed to coalesce, guiding her toward a vast circular chamber. Her headlamp swept across the walls, illuminating a breathtaking mural that spanned the entire room. The colors, preserved by some ancient art, were still vibrant, depicting robed figures with arms outstretched before a circle of towering monoliths. It was a ceremony, a communion. The priests were not just looking at the stones, they were listening, their faces etched with intense concentration, as if catching a faint signal from a distant star. This was the proof her grandmother had dreamed of. Her hands trembled as she dug into her pack, pulling out a large sheet of paper and a piece of charcoal. She had to record this. Pressing the paper against the wall, she began to make a rubbing, the charcoal scraping softly as it blackened the paper and revealed the raised symbols beneath. She focused on a central cluster of glyphs that seemed to form a kind of invocation. As the final symbol was transferred onto the page, the air in the chamber grew cold. The faint whispers sharpened into a single, clear voice, and a shimmering, translucent figure of an old man in ornate robes materialized before the mural. He was the last high priest. His form flickered, unstable, as he spoke a string of melodic, impossible syllables directly toward the stones she had just recorded. It was the lost language, not as a written puzzle, but as living sound. The words were beautiful and alien, but each one felt like a needle driven into her temples. The ghostly image began to fracture and distort, static eating at the edges of the memory. She could either shut her eyes against the blinding pain and let the clue vanish into the silence, or she could force her mind to hold onto the sounds. Gritting her teeth, Elara embraced the agony. She fumbled for her journal, her vision swimming as she desperately scribbled the phonetic sounds, not their meaning, just the raw, auditory shape of the words as the priest had spoken them. As quickly as it appeared, the projection dissolved into motes of light. The pain receded to a dull throb, leaving her exhausted but clutching a priceless key. The language was not inert. It was alive with a power that punished those who sought to understand it. On the wall where the priest had stood, a single rune now pulsed with a soft, amber light. It was an arrow, pointing unmistakably to a dark, descending staircase that opened in the floor, an invitation to go deeper into the heart of the mystery. The staircase descended into a chamber of impossible geometry. Before her, the floor was not solid stone, but a mosaic of interlocking runes, each tile a slightly different shade of gray and faintly glowing. The air hummed with a latent energy that raised the hairs on her arms. This was not a path, it was a test. A single misstep would not just be a mistake, it would be a sentence. Her eyes scanned the pattern, searching for a familiar shape, and her heart leaped. There, scattered throughout the mosaic, were the exact runes whose phonetic sounds she had so painfully transcribed in her journal. The ghostly priest had not just given her a key to the language, he had given her the combination to this lock, but the pressure was immediate and terrifying. She had to recall the precise order of the sounds he had spoken, and then find their matching symbols across this treacherous floor. Her mind, still aching from the earlier assault, felt slow and thick. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she chose caution over courage. She would not make a leap of faith. She would test every step. She opened her journal, the charcoal smudges a fragile anchor in the humming silence. The first sound had been a soft, breathy exhalation, like a sigh. She found its corresponding rune, a simple spiral, just 2 tiles away from the ledge. Holding her breath, she extended her foot and tapped the symbol. It glowed a steady, reassuring white. She committed her full weight to it, and the tile held firm. The second sound was a sharp, clicking consonant. She located its angular rune and stepped onto it. Again, a white glow and solid footing. A fragile confidence began to build. The third sound was a long, melodic vowel. She saw its curving symbol ahead and to the left, and she stepped toward it without the same deliberate care. Her boot landed squarely on the tile, but the edge of her heel brushed against the adjacent rune. The consequence was instantaneous and violent. A jet of searing steam erupted from a hidden vent in the wall, whistling past her face with blistering heat. The smell of scorched cloth filled the air as the sleeve of her jacket blackened and curled. She stumbled back onto the safe tile, her heart hammering against her ribs, the heat of the near miss radiating across her skin. Failure was no longer an abstract concept of being trapped. It was the very real threat of being boiled alive. The pain focused her, burning away the last vestiges of panic. She looked at the journal with new respect, understanding that every mark was a matter of survival. From that moment, She moved with agonizing slowness, sounding out each phonetic clue under her breath before visually confirming its rune, ensuring not a single part of her foot touched the wrong symbol. Step by deliberate step, she navigated the deadly puzzle, the white glow of her correct choices creating a path through the darkness. When her final step landed on the solid ledge at the far side, the glowing runes behind her faded into dull, inert stone. The threat was gone. Before her, the chamber opened into a small, perfectly circular room. In its center, resting on a simple pedestal of unadorned rock, was a single, flawless obsidian stone. It was about the size of her fist, its surface so perfectly smooth and dark, it seemed to be a hole cut into reality itself. The air around it was still and cold. The constant, low hum that had permeated the temple was gone, replaced by a profound and waiting silence. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched its surface. It was cool, not with the chill of a tomb, but with the deep, abiding cold of a thing that had slept for 1,000 years. And as her skin made contact, the stone began to pulse with a soft, internal light, as if a sleeping heart had been awakened by her touch. The obsidian stone warmed beneath her palms, its cool surface flushing with a sudden, living heat. A torrent of images and feelings erupted inside her mind, bypassing her eyes and ears completely. It was not a story told in words, but a symphony of pure emotion, a crushing sorrow for a world lost, a desperate warning that prickled like static across her skin, and beneath it all, a profound, aching plea for help. She saw a great cataclysm, not as a historical event, but as a visceral memory of the sky tearing open and the earth screaming. The force of it threatened to shatter her own consciousness, this foreign grief washing over her identity like a tidal wave. Her grip on reality began to slip, the solid stone of the pedestal feeling less real than the phantom pain of a dying civilization. She could feel herself dissolving into the echo. To pull away was the only sane choice, to sever this link and cling to the person she knew herself to be. But then she remembered the high priest's words, the phonetic sounds she had carved into her journal with such pain. Trusting an instinct deeper than fear, she leaned into the storm. She closed her eyes and whispered the alien syllables back to the stone, her voice a fragile anchor in the psychic maelstrom. The response was immediate. The chaotic flood coalesced, the emotions refining into a clear, singular purpose. This was no mere historical record. The stones were a message in a bottle, cast across the centuries. They were not just whispering, they were calling for a witness, for someone to carry their story forward and complete a task they could not. The stone's inner light dimmed, its energy spent, the connection fading to a soft, empathetic hum in the back of her skull. The message was delivered, but in the newfound quiet, a new sound emerged, a more urgent, fractured whispering that seemed to leak from a dark, jagged crack in the far wall, a breach that promised something far older and far more desperate lay ahead. The crack in the wall was a jagged scar of darkness, its fractured whispers tugging at her mind, but a different sound sliced through the temple's silence. It was the sharp, distinct crunch of gravel under a boot, coming from a shadowed gallery high above. Elara spun around, her headlamp beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate a figure leaning casually against a broken pillar. Kale, his smirk was a familiar, infuriating sight. Well, he called down, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. I must admit, Elara, your methods are unorthodox, but your results are impressive. I have been taking notes. He held up a small, leather-bound journal, identical to the one she carried. All this, the ghost, the puzzle floor, your little performance with the stone. It will make a fascinating appendix to my paper on the rediscovery of the Whispering Stones. Her blood ran cold. Kale was not just a rival, he was a parasite, a scholar who built his career on the plundered work of others. He had followed her, using her as a bloodhound to lead him to the prize, and now he intended to steal it all. The professional betrayal was a physical blow, threatening to invalidate her grandmother's legacy and her own life's work. But the personal violation, the knowledge that he had been watching her struggle and risk her life from the shadows, was a deeper, more dangerous kind of poison. Her first instinct was a raw, screaming fury, to charge up the crumbling stairs and confront him, but the cool weight of the Obsidian stone's memory in her mind was a steadying influence. This was not a university debate. This was a temple of deadly mechanisms and ancient power. Engaging him directly would be a fool's errand. He was bigger, stronger, and he had the high ground. She had to be smarter. She had to use the temple itself. Her eyes darted to the ceiling above Kale's position, where a massive, cracked lintel stone was supported by a precarious-looking arch. Carved into the arch's keystone was a rune she recognized from the Mosaic, one that governed structural stability. Without a word, she turned her back on his taunts and sprinted for the wall beneath the gallery. She slapped her palm against a specific, recessed rune she had noted earlier, one shaped like a breaking wave. She poured all her intent into the contact, thinking not of escape, but of collapse. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, a deep groan shuddered through the stone. The keystone rune flashed once, and with a roar of protesting rock, a section of the ceiling gave way. Dust and debris rained down, not enough to crush Kale, but more than enough to block his direct path to her. Coughing in the thick, chalky air, Elara did not wait to see his reaction. A narrow opening, previously hidden by a fallen slab, was now exposed. She squeezed into the tight passage, the cold, damp stone scraping against her shoulders. Kale's furious shouts followed her, muffled by the rockfall, but she knew it was only a temporary delay. He was resourceful and ruthless, and he would find another way around. The race was no longer just against the temple's decay or her own fear. It was against a man who wanted to erase her from her own discovery. She had to reach the heart of this mystery and decipher its core message before he caught up to steal its voice forever. The passage narrowed into a throat of cold, damp rock before opening into a space of impossible sound. Elara stepped into a circular chamber where the walls were not stone, but a forest of jagged, pale crystals. Each one hummed, vibrating with the layered whispers of 1,000 forgotten voices, amplifying them into a physical force. The sound was a storm inside her skull, a pressure that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. It was not just noise, it was a weapon against thought. To focus here was to fight against the very air. Covering her ears did nothing. The vibrations traveled straight through her bones. The urge to turn back, to escape the sonic assault, was a screaming instinct. But then she saw it, tucked almost out of sight, a single, larger crystal that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, while the others shone white. It was the dissonant heart of the cacophony. An idea, fragile and desperate, sparked in her mind. To silence the noise, she would have to sing to it. She remembered her grandmother's love of music, how she would hum old folk tunes while working, claiming every problem had its own melody. Closing her eyes against the dizzying pressure, Elara tried to grasp one of the simpler, recurring whispers. It was a low, mournful drone. She took a shaky breath and hummed a single, steady note, trying to match its pitch. The crystals around her vibrated in response, the sound intensifying, and she knew she had failed. She was amplifying the problem, not solving it. She forced herself to think differently, to listen not to the sound itself, but to the empty space around it, the harmonic it was missing. She pictured her grandmother's calm, smiling face, a silent anchor in the roaring sea of sound. She hummed again, this time a perfect fifth above the drone. The two notes clashed, and for a breathtaking moment, a small pocket of near silence bloomed around her. It was the key. She moved through the chamber like a musician, tuning a broken instrument, finding each dominant, painful frequency and answering it with its harmonic counterpoint. A sharp, sibilant whisper was met with a soft, rounded tone. A high, piercing shriek was cancelled by a deep, grounding hum. With each correct pairing, a cluster of crystals would dim, their light and sound winking out. The painful pressure in her head began to recede. Finally, only the central, green pulsing crystal remained active, its solitary whisper now clear and plaintive. Elara sang one last pure note. The green crystal flashed once, then shifted to a warm, steady amber. Its light focused into a beam, illuminating a hidden alcove in the wall she had never seen. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, recognizing the familiar, worn cover. It was her grandmother's. The personal connection was a tidal wave, overwhelming the last echoes of the chamber. Her grandmother had been here, had solved this same puzzle, and had died pursuing the secret further in. This was no longer just an academic quest. It was a legacy. She opened the journal. The pages were filled with her grandmother's precise script and sketches, but one page was different. Tucked into the binding was a hand-drawn map, detailing a path to the center of the temple, to a place labeled with a single, powerful word, the Heartstone. A soft scuff of a boot on stone echoed from the passage behind her. Kale had found his way through. Her grandmother's journal felt impossibly heavy in her hands. The familiar, looping script described the final decoding ritual in stark, unambiguous terms. To open a true dialogue with the Heartstone, the seeker must offer a drop of their own blood upon its surface. Elara's rational mind recoiled. This was superstition, the kind of primitive magic her academic training had taught her to dismiss as metaphor. But the memory of the Obsidian, stone's grief, the sentient whisper of the crystals, and the ghostly priest's plea were all evidence she could no longer ignore. This was not a metaphor. It was a mechanism, an ancient technology operating on principles she did not yet understand. The quest was no longer a historical puzzle to be solved with intellect alone. It demanded a physical, personal commitment. A part of her wanted to slam the journal shut, to turn back and preserve the clean, logical world she knew. But a deeper, more compelling instinct whispered that turning back now would be the true betrayal, of her grandmother, of the civilization crying out from the stones, and of the truth itself. Her hands were trembling, but her resolve was solid. She opened a small sewing kit in her pack, selecting a sharp steel pin. She took a deep breath, pressed the point against her fingertip, and pushed. A single, perfect bead of crimson welled up. It was a small, sharp pain, a punctuation mark in the silence. With that simple act, the quest transformed. It was no longer an investigation. It was a pact. She had moved from observer to participant, bound now by a thread of blood and intent. Tucking the journal safely away, she turned to follow the map's final path. The air grew perceptibly colder as she moved deeper. The whispers from the stone walls no longer a chaotic murmur, but a distinct, guiding chant, pulling her toward the sanctum where everything would be decided. The narrow stone bridge was a knife edge over an abyss of absolute blackness. Kale stepped from the shadows at its center, his form blocking the only way forward. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "The journal, Elara, and all your notes. Do not make this difficult." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing in the chasm's vast silence. She clutched the worn leather book to her chest, its presence a fragile shield. "This is my grandmother's work," she countered, her voice tight. "You cannot just steal a lifetime of research." His smile was a cold, sharp thing. "I am not stealing it. I am correcting the historical record. A brilliant, overlooked scholar, that is me, recovering the lost work of a discredited amateur." The casual dismissal of her grandmother's life was the final spark. She tried to shove past him, but he was faster, his hand closing like a vise around her wrist. The struggle was brief and brutal, a silent, grappling dance on the precipice. With a sharp twist, he wrenched the journal from her grip. For a horrifying second, it seemed to hover in the air, and then it was gone, tumbling end over end into the consuming darkness below. A piece of her soul seemed to fall with it. Everything was gone: the map, the phonetic keys, her grandmother's final instructions. Kale laughed, a short, ugly sound. "It seems you are out of options." But he had underestimated the raw, desperate fury her loss had unleashed. She did not try to reason or to fight his strength. She remembered a rune phrase from the crystal chamber, one her grandmother had labeled a warning for unstable ground. She had no idea what it truly meant, only the sounds. She shouted the alien syllables directly into his face. The effect was immediate. The bridge shuddered, not a collapse, but a violent, jarring tremor that sent chips of stone skittering into the void. Kale staggered, his arms flailing for balance. It was the only opening she would get. She ducked under his grasping hand and sprinted, her boots pounding on the vibrating stone. She did not look back. She heard his roar of fury, and then a much louder, more terrifying sound, the groan of fracturing rock. The bridge was coming apart. She threw herself onto the solid ledge of the far side, just as the central span gave way with a deafening roar, crumbling into the abyss and taking Kale's path with it. He was trapped for now, but so was she. The way back was gone, and she was now truly alone, armed with nothing but the fractured echoes of a language burned into her memory, and the chilling certainty that Kale would find another way. The leap was a blind fall into darkness. Her body slammed onto a lower ledge of crumbling rock, the impact jarring her bones and sending a shower of gravel skittering into the void below. She clung to the stone, heart thundering, as the last echoes of the bridge's collapse faded into silence. Before her, carved directly into the living rock of the cavern wall, were 3 identical archways. They offered no physical distinction, but above each one, a single luminous rune glowed with a soft internal light. She knew these words. They were not simple nouns, but the foundational pillars of the civilization she was unraveling. Truth, sacrifice, memory. This was not a test of translation, but of interpretation. A scholar would choose truth, seeking the unvarnished facts of history. A guardian might choose memory to preserve what was lost, but Elara heard the ghost priest's plea echoing in her mind, felt the profound, selfless sorrow of the Obsidian stone. This culture had not built a time capsule. They had built a cry for help, a message that demanded a personal cost to be received. They had sacrificed their own future to send a warning forward. To answer that call required meeting them on their own terms. Without hesitation, her hand resting on the tiny, stinging wound on her finger, she stepped through the archway marked sacrifice. The stone frame rippled like water around her, and the air itself seemed to accept her choice. She emerged into a cavern, so immense her headlamp could not find its ceiling. The walls were not carved, but were a tapestry of raw, crystalline formations that pulsed in time with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated up from the floor. And in the very center of the cavern, resting on a natural dais of fused quartz, was the source of the power. The Heartstone was not a gem or a carved relic. It was a monolith of pure, dark crystal, twice her height, and within its depths, light moved like a captured galaxy. It was alive, and it was waiting for her. The cavern hummed with the Heartstone's own pulse, a vibration that rose through the soles of her boots and into her bones. Each step toward the immense crystal felt like wading through something thicker than air. Its dark surface swirled with captured light, and as she stood before it, she felt impossibly small. This was the moment of commitment. There was no more journal, no more map, only the memory of her grandmother's final instruction and the tiny, willing wound on her finger. She took a final, steadying breath, pressed her bleeding fingertip against the cool, impossibly smooth surface of the Heartstone, and offered her sacrifice. The result was not a simple glow. It was an eruption. Light, pure and blinding, exploded from the monolith's core, flooding the cavern and erasing all shadows. But the true storm was not in her eyes. It was in her mind. The 1,000 fractured whispers she had heard throughout the temple coalesced, weaving together into a single, clear, and overwhelming voice that spoke directly into her consciousness. It was the lost language, not as scattered phonetics, but as a living, flowing river of meaning. Grammar, syntax, history, emotion, it all poured into her at once. The sheer volume of it was a physical weight, a pressure threatening to crack her skull. She could feel the edges of her own self blurring, her childhood memories of her grandmother's kitchen being pushed aside by visions of ancient star charts, and the feel of desert wind on a face that was not her own. Her identity, the very thing that made her Elara, was dissolving in this ocean of alien thought. To surrender felt like the easiest choice, to let go and become a perfect, empty vessel for the past. But then she saw it, a flicker in the mental maelstrom, her grandmother's face, not as a ghost, but as a memory she fiercely clung to. She focused on the laugh lines around her eyes, the smell of old books and chamomile tea that always clung to her clothes, the sound of her voice humming an old folk tune. This was her anchor. She wrapped her consciousness around this singular, personal point of light and held on, not fighting the flow of information, but learning to ride the current. She allowed the language to fill her, but she refused to let it erase her. It was a terrifying, exquisite balance, maintaining the core of who she was while opening every part of her mind to an understanding that was not her own. The stakes in this silent battle were absolute, the preservation of her soul against the acquisition of ultimate knowledge. As she mastered the flow, the language's purpose snapped into devastating clarity. The stones were not a historical record or a simple plea. They were a sophisticated, planetary warning system built to monitor a deep, cyclical cataclysm, a period of immense geological and cosmic upheaval that slept like a beast beneath the world. And the timer was counting down. The civilization had not died out. They had sacrificed themselves to encode this message and hibernate the threat, a temporary solution that was now reaching its expiration. The full, terrifying weight of this truth settled onto her shoulders alone. She was not just a translator. She was the sole inheritor of a countdown to an extinction-level event. The vision did not fade, it settled, a dreadful certainty crystallizing in her mind. The ancient people did not vanish in a sudden, unknowable cataclysm. They saw it coming. Their scholars had mapped the slow, cosmic dance of the planets, predicting a rare alignment whose gravitational pull would awaken the sleeping faults deep within the Earth. They had the knowledge to prepare, to evacuate, to mitigate, but they failed to act in time. Their end was not a mystery, it was a failure of will, and the stars were aligning once more, the same celestial clockwork, ticking toward an identical upheaval in a matter of days. The weight of this knowledge was a physical pressure, crushing the air from her lungs. She was a linguist, not a world leader, not a geophysicist. She stood alone in the dark, holding a secret that could save millions, a truth so enormous and bizarre that speaking it aloud would brand her a madwoman. Who would believe a story of whispering stones and ghostly priests? Panic would be the first and only result. But silence was a sentence of death. Her duty was no longer to the sanctity of this place, but to every living person beyond its walls. She had to get out. She had to document this, to find a way to translate this esoteric warning into a language the modern world could understand, and, against all odds, trust. Her resolve hardened just as a figure detached itself from a shadowed crevice she had not seen. Kale. His clothes were torn and dust-covered, his face a mask of pure, avaricious fury. And in his hand, he held a heavy, jagged rock. "You have taken everything from me," he snarled, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the pulsating Heartstone. "My reputation, my bridge, but this power will be mine to study, to control." He raised the rock high, poised to shatter the crystal monolith and claim a fragment of its power as his trophy. "Do not touch it." Elara's warning was a raw shout in the lost language, the words feeling like fire in her throat. But Kale's eyes were glazed with a fanatic's hunger, his mind closed to any reason but possession. He brought the jagged rock down with all his strength onto a delicate, protruding crystal at the Heartstone's base. The sound was not a crack, but but a shriek, a high-frequency scream of breaking reality. A web of brilliant, angry light fractured across the monolith's surface. For a single, suspended heartbeat, everything was silent. Then the world broke open. A shockwave of raw, untamed energy erupted from the stone, a silent concussion of force that threw them both backward like discarded dolls. Elara's body slammed into the cavern wall, the impact driving the air from her lungs. The entire chamber groaned in protest, a deep, seismic shudder that sent ancient stalactites trembling loose from the ceiling high above. Through the ringing in her ears and the swirling dust, she saw Kale sprawled on the ground, dazed and clutching his arm. His trophy rock was gone, vaporized in the backlash. His greed had not just stolen knowledge, it had broken the one thing holding the delicate balance in check. A sharp, cracking sound directly above him snapped her head up. A massive spear of stone was peeling away from the ceiling, its shadow falling over his helpless form. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to run, to leave him to the fate he had so arrogantly earned. He had stolen her work, destroyed a priceless artifact, and endangered the entire world. But watching a man die, even him, was a line she could not cross. With a gritted curse, she pushed off from the wall and lunged, her body moving before her mind could debate the morality of it. Her hands closed on the collar of his jacket, and she hauled with all her remaining strength, dragging him backward just as the colossal stalactite shattered on the spot where he had lain. The floor buckled under the impact. The temple's structural integrity, maintained for millennia by the Heartstone's stable energy, was now unraveling at a terrifying speed. The deep, resonant hum of the stone twisted, warping into a piercing, panicked scream that echoed from the very walls. The whispers were now screams of alarm, a civilization's final safeguard, wailing as their failsafe shattered. Rocks and dust rained down around them, sealing the way they had come. Through the chaos, a single escape route presented itself, a dark, water-filled tunnel at the cavern's rear, its entrance glowing with the reflected, frantic light of the dying Heartstone. They were out of time, and the cataclysm they were meant to warn the world about had just been invited to arrive early. The water was a shock of icy blackness, swallowing them whole. Elara kept her grip locked on Kale's arm, kicking desperately as the tunnel ceiling shuddered, raining gravel into the water around them. There was no light, no air, only the roaring in her ears and the terrifying knowledge that the entire mountain was coming down on their heads. Her lungs burned, screaming for oxygen. She could let go. One simple release of her fingers, and the man who had tried to destroy everything would be silenced by the temple he had defiled. It would be justice, simple and brutal, but her hand, numb with cold, refused to obey that dark impulse. She pulled him forward, kicking through the churning water, her mind focused on a single, primal command. Swim. The current grabbed them, a sudden, powerful pull that swept them through the narrowing tunnel. Her shoulder scraped against rough stone, and then, miraculously, a faint, greenish glow appeared ahead. With the last of her strength, she aimed for it, dragging Kale's dead weight behind her. They burst through a curtain of hanging vines into a silent, hidden grotto, gasping and choking on sweet, open air. For a long moment, they simply lay on the muddy bank, heaving and shivering. The roar of the collapsing temple was now a distant, muffled rumble. They were outside. The sky above the grotto's opening was a deep, bruised purple, the first stars pricking through the twilight. They were alive, but they were stranded, miles from any road or outpost, with only the clothes on their backs and a secret that was now screaming into a void. The mission to warn the world felt more impossible than ever. The mud was cold and clinging. Elara lay on the riverbank, her body a single, throbbing ache, listening to the distant, final groan of the dying temple. Beside her, Kale coughed, a wet, ragged sound. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his face pale and smeared with dirt, his right arm cradled awkwardly against his chest. He would not meet her eyes. "I was a fool," he whispered, the words barely audible over the rushing water. His voice held none of its former arrogance, only a hollowed-out shame. "The stones, the language, your grandmother's work, all of it, it is all real, and I nearly destroyed it for a footnote in a journal." He finally looked at her, his gaze raw. "You were right. I was wrong." The admission hung in the humid air between them, a fragile offering. Every part of Elara, from her bruised muscles to her grieving heart, wanted to reject it. To leave him there in the mud and begin the impossible journey alone. Trusting him felt like handing a lit match back to an arsonist. But the ground beneath them chose that moment to shudder, a deep, visceral tremor that sent ripples across the surface of the grotto's pool. It was not an echo of the collapse, but a new, forward-looking threat. The Heartstone's broken scream was already echoing in the bones of the world. She looked at Kale, truly looked at him, and saw past the rival to the broken man, a capable scholar, now humbled and terrified, who understood the magnitude of what was at stake. His skills, his knowledge of the region, his sheer physical strength, if his arm healed, they were no longer threats. They were resources the world desperately needed. "We do not have a choice," she said, her own voice hoarse. "I cannot do this alone. No one can." He nodded slowly, a grim understanding passing between them. The race for glory was over, replaced by a grim relay for survival. She offered him a hand up. His grip was weak, but the intent was firm. The alliance was forged not in friendship, but in shared dread. Their first steps into the jungle were a slow, painful negotiation with the terrain and each other. He leaned on her for support on the uneven ground, and she relied on his good arm to push aside thick, grasping vines. Every rustle in the canopy, every distant animal call, was a fresh jolt of adrenaline. The tension between them was a live wire, a constant, silent question of whether this truce would hold. Then the earth trembled again, a longer, more insistent roll that set the leaves trembling. They froze, hands instinctively gripping each other's arms for balance, their shared fear a stronger bond than any promise. The path ahead was long, and the clock was ticking in the very soil beneath their feet. Every step was a battle against the jungle and their own exhaustion. Their progress was achingly slow, a desperate slog through mud and thorny undergrowth. On the third day, Elara stopped, her legs trembling with fatigue. She picked up a fallen branch, snapped it to a point, and knelt in a patch of soft earth. "We do not have the luxury of waiting for a quiet library," she said, her voice raspy. "We learn now, or we fail." She began to draw, the stick scraping in the dirt. "These are the alignment symbols," she explained, sketching the elegant, looping glyphs for the sun, the moon, and the wandering stars. "This is not poetry, it is a clock." Kale watched, His good arm braced against a tree, his analytical mind cutting through the fog of his pain. He saw the geometry in the curves, the mathematical precision hidden within the art. His phone, its screen a spiderweb of cracks, and its battery, hovering at 5%, flickered to life. He had downloaded regional star charts months ago for a different project. "Can you give me the phonetic for the 7th alignment, the one shaped like a falling leaf?" he asked, his focus absolute. She spoke the soft, sighing word. He typed it with one clumsy finger, cross-referencing it against the charts. His eyes widened. "The data matches," he whispered. "The ancient configuration. It is not just a story. It is an astronomical event that recurs every 5,000 years. And according to this, the peak alignment is not in days. It is in hours." The confirmation was a cold fist, closing around Elara's heart. She had known, but hearing it stated with modern, digital certainty made the threat terrifyingly real. She continued to draw, but she was careful, deliberate. She taught him the words for danger, for earth shift, for sky fire, the vocabulary of the warning, but she kept the deeper phrases to herself, the songs for greeting the dawn, and the stories of the first stone singers. Those were not for a phone screen or a rushed lesson in the mud. They were the soul of a people, and that soul needed a more respectful keeper. The ground chose that moment to answer their fears. A low rumble built, not from the sky, but from deep below, and the trees around them began to sway, their leaves hissing as if in panic. The path ahead cracked, a fresh fissure splitting the earth open just meters from where they stood. They were running out of time, out of space, out of everything but dread. Then, as the tremor subsided, Kale pointed through a break in the canopy, his hand shaking. A light, in the deepening twilight, far down the valley slope, a single, steady electric beacon shone against the purple gloom. It was a ranger outpost, a tiny pinprick of the modern world, and their only chance to turn a whispered secret into a worldwide scream. The ranger outpost was a single room of weathered wood and humming electronics, a fragile bubble of modern logic in the ancient jungle. The head ranger, a man named Janssen, with a face etched by sun and skepticism, listened to their frantic story with arms crossed. He saw two filthy, bleeding people, babbling about planetary alignments and screaming crystals. He reached for his first aid kit, his expression one of practiced patience. "You have heat stroke, or maybe you hit your heads," he said, his tone suggesting this was not the first wild tale he had heard from lost hikers. Kale tried to interject with astronomical data, but his cracked phone died, the screen going black. Janssen just shook his head. "We get conspiracy theorists up here all the time. This is a new one, I will give you that, but without proof, it is just noise." Elara felt the world shrinking, the immense truth in her mind becoming a prisoner inside this tiny, rational room. Causing a panic would get them sedated, not believed. She had to speak a language this man could not dismiss. She closed her eyes, blocking out his doubtful face, and reached for the simplest, most foundational word in the lost tongue, the one for listen. It was a sound like a plucked string and a soft wind. She did not shout it. She breathed it into the quiet room, directing the intent not at the ranger, but at a small, decorative chunk of quartz sitting on his desk. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the quartz began to hum, a clear, resonant note that filled the small space. It was not loud, but it was unmistakable, a vibration you could feel in your teeth. The piece of rock on his desk, a paperweight he had owned for years, was singing. Janssen's professional composure shattered. He stared at the humming crystal, then back at Elara, his eyes wide with a primal confusion that bypassed all his modern training. "That is impossible," he whispered. The simple, undeniable physics of it was a key that turned a lock in his mind. He did not understand, but he could no longer deny. He lunged for the heavy satellite phone on its charging cradle, his hands fumbling with the buttons. "I need to patch a call through to the geological survey. Emergency priority," he barked into the receiver. His voice was tight with a new, urgent fear. He was halfway through reciting his authorization code when the world lurched. A violent tremor slammed through the outpost, throwing them all against the walls. The lights flickered, died, and plunged them into a darkness that was filled with the roar of the earth itself. The vehicle was a battered 4x4, its suspension groaning with every fresh tremor that rippled under the tires. Ranger Janssen drove, his knuckles white on the wheel, while his voice crackled over the satellite radio, repeating their desperate warning to any official in the capital who would listen. The response was a chaotic mix of skepticism and dawning alarm. Elara clung to her seat, watching the jungle blur past, every muscle in her body wound tight. The countdown was no longer an abstract number. It was the vibration in the steering column and the dust shaking loose from the ceiling. This was no longer a journey of discovery, but a frantic sprint toward a finish line they could not see. The main highway, their only clear route, was a serpent of cracked asphalt winding through the foothills. Then they rounded a bend and slammed on the brakes. The road ahead was gone, buried under a mountain of fresh earth and shattered trees. A landslide had cut them off completely. Janssen got on the radio, his voice strained as he reported the blockage and requested an airlift. The reply was grim. All available aircraft were being diverted for urban evacuation. No one was coming for them. "We have to turn back, find another route," Janssen said, already shifting into reverse. But Elara was staring at an old, overgrown track, veering off into the steep mountains, a path not on any of his modern maps. Her fingers tingled, and in her mind, she heard the faint, melodic whisper of the stones. A word she now understood meant shortcut. "It is this way," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "We have to take the pass." Kale, pale and sweating in the back seat, shook his head. "That is not a road, Elara. It is a goat trail. It could be a dead end. We could get stuck, or worse." Every rational argument was on his side, but waiting felt like a slower, more certain death. "Trust me," she insisted, her gaze locked on the narrow opening in the trees. "The stones showed me the way. It is our only chance." Janssen looked from her determined face to the blocked highway, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. With a sharp curse, he wrenched the wheel and aimed the vehicle up the treacherous incline. The climb was a nightmare of skidding tires and scraping metal. The path was barely wider than the truck, a crumbling ledge with a sheer drop on one side. Each new tremor sent pebbles skittering into the abyss. Elara guided them, not with a map, but with an internal compass, tuned to the fading hum in her mind, pointing them ever upward. One wrong turn, one misplaced trust in a crumbling edge of rock, and they would plummet into the ravine, their warning dying with them. They crested the final ridge as the sun bled into the horizon, and the sprawling capital city glittered below, a tapestry of lights against the gathering dark. For a single, heart-lifting moment, it looked like salvation. Then a sound tore through the evening air, a deep, groaning crack that rolled down from the snow-capped peaks high above the city. It was the sound of the mountain itself beginning to break. The makeshift command center was a chaotic symphony of flickering screens and tense voices, set up in a repurposed warehouse on the city's edge. Elara and Kale stood over a large printed map of the region, their hands trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion and adrenaline. Around them, the small team of geologists who had believed their impossible story worked furiously, cross-referencing the ancient star charts with real-time seismic data. The numbers were not just matching, they were converging. Kale pointed to a specific point on the fault line, his finger tracing a path only he and Elara could fully see. The seventh alignment, the falling leaf configuration, he said, his voice raspy. It acts like a key, applying maximum gravitational stress right here at the junction of the two plates. The ancient warning was not a vague prophecy. It was a precise geological forecast. The main rupture would occur directly under the city's oldest district, the historical quarter, built on the most unstable ground, and it would happen in less than 2 hours. The lead geologist, a woman named Dr. Vance, looked from the map to their desperate faces. The data is compelling, she admitted, her professional skepticism warring with the terrifying evidence. But an official evacuation order requires the mayor's signature, and he is still worried about panic and economic collapse. He sees empty hotels and canceled conferences, not collapsing buildings. Elara did not pause to think. Her professional reputation, the one she had spent a lifetime building, felt like a small, insignificant coin in her hand. She pushed past the tables and monitors toward the mayor, who was speaking in low, worried tones on a satellite phone. She stood before him, her clothes still stained with temple mud, her eyes holding the grief of an entire extinct civilization. "You can choose to see me as a discredited academic," she told him, her voice clear and steady, carrying the weight of the whispers within her. "Or you can see me as the sole survivor of a people who died because their leaders waited too long. I am staking my career, my name, and everything I am on this." The silence in the warehouse was absolute. The mayor stared at her, the phone still pressed to his ear, and in that moment, he was not a politician weighing costs, but a man facing a truth too large to ignore. He slowly lowered the phone and gave a single, grim nod. "The order is given. Evacuate the historical quarter." The moment the words left his mouth, the city's emergency sirens began their slow, rising wail, a sound of chilling finality. As the first teams scrambled to execute the plan, a deep, groaning roar built from beneath their feet. The ground heaved, throwing them all against the tables. Through the rattling windows, they watched the main communications tower, a symbol of the city's modern power, sway like a sapling and then crumble into a cloud of dust and twisted metal. The foreshock had arrived. The countdown was over. The sirens wailed a chorus of pure dread, but the streets were a maze of human fear. Elara and Kale moved against the tide of the evacuation, their purpose a stark contrast to the surrounding panic. They were not fleeing, they were hunting for the specific points of failure the ancient language had described. Kale pointed to a wide plaza, his voice cutting through the noise. "The word for weak earth," he shouted. "The resonance here is all wrong. The ground is a drumskin." He redirected a flow of people away from the open space, toward a narrower, older street that the stones had identified as stable bedrock. Elara listened to the hum of the city, a skill she had learned in the temple, and heard a dissonant vibration coming from a modern parking garage. That structure is singing the song of collapse, she yelled to a harried police officer, who, after one look at her intense certainty, began rerouting traffic. Their knowledge was no longer academic. It was a real-time map of the city's impending wounds. They were translating prophecy into action, saving hundreds with every corrected turn, every shouted warning about a building that looked solid but was, according to the whispers, already dead inside. Amid the chaos, a new sound pierced through, the frantic cries of children coming from a school that sat directly on the fault line's most volatile junction. The official evacuation teams had bypassed it, deeming the area too unstable for a systematic approach. A fire crew was nearby, their truck idling, the captain shaking his head in grim resignation. "Protocol says we fall back," he yelled over the din. "We cannot risk more lives." Elara looked at Kale, his face a mirror of her own internal conflict. The rational choice was to retreat, to preserve their own lives, to continue their warning. But the ancient language was not built on cold logic. It was built on sacrifice. The ghosts of a civilization that had failed to act would not let them make the same calculation. "We are not following protocol," Elara told the fire captain, her voice steady. "We are rewriting it." She quickly sketched the school's layout in the dirt, using the lost symbols to show where the foundation was most likely to fail first. Kale coordinated with the crew, using his understanding of the temple's structural principles to identify the single safest point of entry. It was a desperate, fragile plan. They burst into the crumbling building, the air thick with plaster dust, and the terrified sobs of a dozen children huddled under their desks. Working with the firefighters, they formed a human chain, passing small, trembling forms from one set of arms to the next. Elara carried the last child, a little girl clutching her stuffed animal, out into the fractured daylight. As her feet touched the asphalt, the world gave a final, violent lurch. It was not a tremor anymore. It was the planet itself roaring in fury. The ground beneath them heaved in a massive, rolling wave, and the school behind them emitted a deep, groaning crack as its foundation surrendered completely. The world was not shaking. It was coming apart at the seams. Elara wrapped her arms around a steel lamppost. Her body whipped back and forth like a rag doll as the pavement beneath her buckled and split. Through the blinding dust, she saw the city performing a grotesque dance. Buildings in the historical quarter swayed and crumbled, but they fell inward, onto evacuated streets, not onto crowds of people. The ancient warning had been a precise, cruel map, and they had read it correctly. A primal instinct, deeper than thought, rose from her core. She shouted a phrase into the roaring chaos, the lost words for shelter and endurance, a plea not to a god, but to the very stones beneath the city. It was not a spell, but an affirmation, a final, desperate act of trust in the knowledge that had cost so much. This was the trial by fire. The cataclysm the old ones had died to document was here, and it was every bit as terrible as their ghosts had promised. But the streets where people should have been were empty. The areas they had cleared were taking the brutal impact. but the silence from those zones was the silence of concrete and rebar, not of human lives abruptly ended. Her only role now was to endure, to hold on and bear witness to the terrifying power of a truth that had been whispered across millennia. When the violent convulsions finally ceased, the transition was jarring. An eerie, thick silence descended, broken only by the groans of settling wreckage and the first faint cries of survivors calling out in the dust-choked air. Dawn broke over a city, silenced by its own ruin. The air was thick with a pale, choking dust that caught the low morning light, turning the world into a hazy dream of broken shapes. Elara moved through the devastation not as a scholar, but as a laborer, her hands raw and her body aching with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. Beside her, Kale used a crude listening device made from a salvaged pipe, pressing his ear to mounds of rubble, interpreting the faintest tremors and echoes. A shift in the hum, a certain rhythmic tap from below, and he would point. Here, he would say, his voice hoarse. They are alive here, and the rescue teams, who had once eyed them with suspicion, now moved without question, digging where they indicated, pulling survivors from tombs of concrete and steel. They were no longer the prophets of a bizarre doomsday cult. They were the architects of the miracle that had saved thousands. The whispers had become a lifeline. The world wanted to give them a crown. University deans arrived with offers of endowed chairs and their own research departments, their promises gleaming amidst the grime. Television producers, their satellite trucks parked on the edge of the destruction, offered Elara a platform to tell her story to the globe. She could have had fame, authority, everything she had once thought she wanted. She looked at the microphone thrust toward her, then at the cracked earth where a playground had been, and she quietly declined. The spotlight felt like a new kind of tomb, one that would seal the profound, living truth of the stones into a neat, consumable narrative. The knowledge was not hers to sell. It was a sacred trust, a fragile echo that demanded a more careful keeper. In a rare moment of stillness, she found herself on the outskirts of the rescue efforts, looking toward the distant, hazy line of mountains. The temple was gone now, buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock, its voice finally stilled after 1,000 years of waiting. Its primary duty was done. The warning had been delivered, and in the most brutal way possible, it had been proven right. But as she stood there, the ghost of a whisper brushed against her memory, a final phrase from the Heartstone that spoke not of endings, but of guardianship. The knowledge of the stones was a living thing, a seed that had been passed to her, and its purpose was not just to prevent one disaster, but to help a world learn to listen to the earth beneath its feet once more. The real work, she understood, was only just beginning. The city's gratitude arrived not with a ceremony, but with a quiet, anonymous endowment, a fund whose only condition was that its purpose remained discreet. With Kale as her pragmatic partner, Elara established a small foundation housed in an unmarked building on a quiet, tree-lined street. Its official mandate was obscure linguistic research, but its true purpose was far grander. They became the new librarians for a library of stone, the guardians of a truth too potent for public consumption. The knowledge of the whispering stones would be preserved, studied, and applied, but it would never be sold, never be weaponized, and never be diluted into a spectacle. This was the compromise she forged within herself, the desire to shout their discoveries from the rooftops, to let every geologist and historian share in the wonder, was a constant ache. But she had seen what happened when such power was approached with greed, and she had felt the cost of its misuse in the trembling of the earth. Secrecy was not about hoarding. It was about protecting the world from a truth it was not yet ready to handle responsibly. So she became a gatekeeper, those who sought their help, a mining company baffled by inexplicable seismic readings, or an archaeologist uncovering anomalous acoustic properties in a dig site, were subjected to a rigorous vetting process. She looked less at their credentials and more into their eyes, searching for the hunger that had once burned in Kale's gaze. She taught only those who demonstrated a reverence for the knowledge itself, not for the fame it could bring. The stakes had transformed from preventing a single cataclysm to the long-term stewardship of an entire branch of forgotten science, a responsibility that felt both immense and deeply personal. In her small, sunlit office, on a desk cluttered with modern papers and ancient sketches, a single, palm-sized whispering stone rested. It was a fragment from the temple, its surface cool and smooth. It did not scream with visions or project ghosts. It simply hummed, a soft, steady tone that was felt more than heard, a constant physical connection to the deep, silent language of the world. It was her compass, her reminder, and her promise. The soft hum of the whispering stone on her desk was the first sound her students learned to truly hear. Years had woven a quiet rhythm into Elara's life, a rhythm built around mentoring the small, carefully chosen group who gathered in her study. She did not just teach them the phonetics and grammar of the lost language, she taught them its weight. Every syllable carried the echo of a civilization's sacrifice, and to learn it was to accept a sacred duty. The knowledge was a live wire, and her foundation was the insulation that kept it from sparking a fire it could not control. This was the legacy she had forged from the ruins of the old world, a covenant of quiet guardianship passed from her hands to the next. Yet, human nature remained the most unpredictable fault line. A student named Leo, brilliant and fiercely ambitious, began to chafe at the restrictions. He saw the guarded archives not as a tomb of perils, but as a vault of power, and he believed his intellect entitled him to its contents. The confrontation was inevitable. He stood before her one afternoon, his demand for the restricted texts on harmonic amplification, not a request, but a challenge. "You are hoarding history," he accused, his pride a brittle shield. "You fear that others might surpass your understanding." Elara felt an old, familiar sorrow. She saw the ghost of Kale's early avarice flicker in the young man's eyes. To grant him access would be to hand a lit match to a man standing in a room full of kindling. Her choice was a painful, surgical cut. She expelled him from the program, revoking his access to every fragment of knowledge. Watching him leave, his potential curdled into resentment, was one of the hardest moments of her life, a necessary wound to protect a greater truth. The eternal struggle was not against the stones or the earth, but against the endless human capacity to twist wonder into a weapon. That evening, as dusk settled over the quiet street, a package arrived. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, but the handwriting was unmistakably Kale's. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was her grandmother's journal. The cover was worn but clean, the spine expertly restored. Tucked within its pages was a brief note. "It belonged with you," it read. "Some bridges should never be burned." Her fingers traced the familiar, looping script. the same words that had guided her into the dark, and now welcomed her into a future she was building page by page. The past and the future were no longer at odds, but in conversation, and she was the gentle voice between them. The desert heat shimmered above the red stone, but it was a different kind of warmth that caught Elara's attention. A subtle, resonant hum traveled up through the soles of her boots, a sensation she had not felt since standing before the Heartstone. It was impossibly faint, a single, clear note in the vast silence of the canyon. Her team was busy documenting a well-known burial site a mile back, but this call was for her alone. She followed the feeling to a secluded rock face, its surface shadowed by an overhang, and there it was. A petroglyph, carved with a familiar, elegant precision. It was not just a similar style, it was the exact same grammatical marker used in the Whispering Stones to denote a subordinate clause, a piece of linguistic syntax she had once believed was unique to that single, lost civilization. Her breath caught. This changed everything. The language was not confined to one hidden temple. It was a thread woven across the ancient world, connecting cultures and continents that history had declared strangers. The implications were staggering, a Rosetta Stone for humanity's deepest, most forgotten conversations. The thrill of the find was a lightning strike, but it was immediately followed by a heavy, chilling dread. This was no longer just about guarding one secret. It was about mapping a hidden network of power and knowledge scattered across the globe. To announce this would ignite a firestorm of reckless exploration, with corporations and governments scrambling to claim these sites, tearing them apart for energy or weapons without understanding the delicate, sentient systems they were disturbing. She stood at a crossroads under the relentless sun. The academic in her screamed to publish, to share this monumental key with the world. But the guardian, the woman who had felt a mountain break, knew that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. Her choice was made with a quiet, firm resolve. She would not call the media or alert the local university. From her pack, she took her charcoal and paper, the same tools she had used in the Sunken Temple, and began to make a meticulous rubbing. This discovery would be documented, studied, and archived within the secure walls of her foundation, shared only with the small, trusted circle who understood the weight of this legacy. The potential for understanding was infinite, but so was the capacity for destruction. As she carefully peeled the paper away, capturing the ancient message, a dry wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the faint, familiar scent of ozone and stone. The polished stone felt warm and alive in Kale's palm, its gentle hum a quiet secret between them. It was a far cry from the jagged rock he had once raised in fury. His paper, published under both their names, had sent ripples through the academic establishment. It did not present the Whispering Stones as magic, but as a sophisticated ancient technology, a data storage system that operated on acoustic and resonant principles modern science was only beginning to grasp. He argued for a new methodology, one where a scholar's intuition and sensory awareness were not dismissed as unscientific, but were treated as essential tools for asking the right questions of the past. The response was a storm of both awe and contempt. Respected journals published scathing critiques from traditionalists who called it poetic nonsense, a dangerous slide into mysticism. Yet, for the first time, they were not being ignored. Younger researchers, tired of dry, disconnected analysis, began citing their work, seeing in it a blueprint for a more holistic form of inquiry. Their credibility was no longer a fringe dream, it was a contested fortress they had built together. So when the offer arrived from a prestigious university, a department chairmanship with a generous salary and a state-of-the-art lab, the condition attached was a calculated insult. He was to publicly reframe his research, downplaying the so-called intuitive elements and Elara's foundational role. It was an attempt to co-opt his credibility while neutering the very heart of their discovery. He did not even consult her. His refusal letter was brief, polite, and utterly uncompromising. He was not just turning down a job, he was defending a truth that had cost them both too much to ever bargain with. That evening, Elara placed the small, humming stone in his hand. It was more than a gift, it was an acknowledgement. He had not just been redeemed in her eyes, he had become the guardian she always hoped he could be. Their partnership was now a living argument for a new kind of knowledge, one that understood that some of the world's greatest secrets are not found by digging, but by listening. The data streamed in from listening posts, nestled at sacred sites, from the Scottish Highlands to the Australian outback. For months, the patterns had seemed like random noise, the gentle background hum of a sleeping earth. Then Elara spotted it, a faint, synchronized pulse repeating at intervals so vast they defied human timescales. It was not localized, not a single site whispering in isolation. Every post, from every continent, was humming the same quiet, coordinated note. The whispering stones were not individual monuments, they were nodes in a single, planet-wide network, a nervous system woven into the very crust of the world. This changed the entire narrative of the Cataclysm. The ancient event was not a freak accident or a one-time punishment. It was part of a natural, cyclical process, as regular and inevitable as the planet's orbit, a planetary heartbeat with a rhythm measured in millennia. The sheer scale of the realization was a weight that settled deep in the room. Their duty was no longer to prevent a single disaster, but to maintain a vigil that would outlive them, their children, and their children's children, a watch against a cycle whose next turn was already ticking down. The question was no longer if they should act, but how. Do we take this to the world's governments? Kale asked, his voice quiet in the humming control room. Do we hand them a truth that could trigger global panic, or, worse, a frantic, destructive race to weaponize these sites? The team debated through the night, the stakes clearer than ever. A public revelation could shatter global stability, but secrecy felt like a betrayal of the very people they were sworn to protect. In the end, the vote was unanimous. They would not broadcast the truth to the masses. Instead, they would establish a confidential, international council, a small, vetted group of the world's most trusted geologists, historians, and ethicists. This council would become the silent guardian of the pulse, managing the flow of information with a discretion that balanced preparedness with peace. The survival of civilization now depended not on a frantic reaction, but on a patient, generational understanding of the planet's deepest rhythms. As the Council held its first encrypted virtual meeting, a new data point flickered across the main screen. A subtle, complex harmonic wove itself into the established pulse. It was different from the low, warning drone they had decoded before. This new signal carried a distinct, almost melodic signature. It was not a scream of alarm, but a quiet, deliberate, and unmistakable greeting. The stone was cool and smooth beneath Lynn's palm, a small, unassuming gray rock in a remote cave, yet it hummed with a familiar, low-grade energy. Elara watched from a respectful distance, her own heart a drumbeat of memory and anxiety. This was Lynn's first solo contact, a simple greeting protocol Elara had identified weeks ago. The young woman closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration as she breathed the first soft, sighing syllable of the lost language into the stone's surface. For a long moment, nothing happened. Elara's own doubts whispered loudly. Was she pushing too hard, too fast? Was she burdening this brilliant young mind with a responsibility that had nearly broken her? Then the stone pulsed, a single, warm flash of amber light. A wave of pure, uncomplicated welcome washed over them, a feeling of gentle acknowledgement that made Lynn's eyes fly open, wide with a stunned and radiant awe. It was the same look Elara had seen in her own reflection, a lifetime ago, standing before the first monolith. The torch was being passed, and the weight of it was terrifying. Her instinct was to step forward, to correct Lynn's posture, to suggest a different inflection for the next phrase. This knowledge was so fragile, so perilous. One wrong word could have consequences she could not predict, but clamping down with rigid control would only create a technician, not a guardian. A true successor needed to build their own relationship with the stones, to learn their language not from a textbook, but from the living rock itself. Elara forced her feet to remain rooted to the cave floor. She folded her arms, becoming a silent observer, a safety net rather than a director. She would offer support only when Lynn asked for it. The future of their entire endeavor, the vigil against the planet's deep cycles, depended not on creating a perfect replica of herself, but on nurturing a new, unique, and capable voice. Lynn, emboldened by the initial success, tried a more complex sequence of sounds. Her voice wavered, missing the harmonic resonance needed for a clear response. The stone's light flickered uncertainly. Elara's fingernails dug into her palms, but she held her silence. Lynn paused, took a deep breath, and listened. She adjusted her pitch, trying again, this time matching the stone's inherent vibration. The light stabilized, glowing with a steady, approving warmth. A slow smile spread across Lynn's face, a look of personal triumph that no amount of direct instruction could ever foster. In that moment, Elara knew her choice was right. The student had to find her own path through the whispers. As Lynn's confidence solidified, her connection to the stone deepening with each correct interpretation, the energy in the cave shifted. The gentle hum amplified, rising in pitch and complexity. The simple gray stone began to glow from within, its light projecting upwards not as a mere glow, but as a precise, intricate pattern. A star map, vast and breathtakingly detailed, materialized across the rough-hewn cave ceiling. Constellations unknown to any modern chart glittered in the dark rock, with a single, pulsing line of light tracing a course from a distant nebula directly toward a point on their own world. The message of welcome was complete. This was something else entirely, a new mystery waiting not for Elara, but for the young woman now standing at the threshold of her own legacy. The control room screens flared a violent, warning crimson. It was not a single whisper from one sacred site, but a planetary scream. Every listening post, from the deep ocean, trenches to the highest mountain peaks registered the same terrifying spike, a massive energy surge boiling up from the planet's molten core. The ancient alignment was not a distant theory anymore. It was a present and active threat, a geological heart attack triggered by the same celestial clockwork that had doomed the first civilization. The Global Council erupted into a chorus of panicked voices and translating algorithms, but Elara's voice cut through the noise with a terrifying calm. The dampeners, she said. The lore described planetary dampeners. They are not just stories, they are real, and we have to find them now. It was a global treasure hunt, with a timer measured in minutes. Kale and his team Cross referenced the Council's real-time geological data, with the cryptic locations in the deepest archives, pinpointing resonant chambers hidden deep within the Alps, buried under Antarctic ice, and submerged in the Mariana Trench. These were not machines as humanity understood them, but focal points where the planet's own energy could be gently guided and soothed. The instructions were terrifyingly clear. A specific sequence of harmonic commands, spoken in the lost tongue, had to be delivered simultaneously to each dampener by a trained guardian on site, their voices and intent acting as tuning forks for the entire network. From their quiet headquarters, Elara became the conductor of this planetary orchestra. Her voice, fed through a custom-built resonator that amplified its unique sonic signature, was patched through to the guardians across the globe. She guided each one, her words a steady stream of ancient syntax and profound reassurance as they spoke their parts into the stone. One by one, the frantic energy readings at each site began to stabilize, their violent crimson shifting to a calmer amber. But the central core surge, the epicenter of the crisis, continued to rage. The final command was for her alone, a phrase so potent, the archives warned it could only be spoken once in a generation. It was not a request, it was a binding. To speak, it was to forge a temporary circuit between her own life force and the planet's raging heart, to offer a part of her own vitality as a stabilizing anchor. There was no time for fear or debate. She closed her eyes, blocking out the frantic screens and the worried faces, and found the core of stillness the stones had taught her. She poured every memory, every sorrow, every hope into the words. The grief of the lost civilization, the joy of Lynn's first connection, the weight of her grandmother's journal. She did not shout the command. She breathed it into the resonator with the entirety of her being. The sound was not loud, but it was impossibly deep, a vibration that seemed to still the very air in the room. On the main screen, the central surge graph plummeted, the violent red line collapsing into a steady, peaceful green. The alignment had passed. The planet was stable. And Elara simply folded, her body surrendering to a profound and total exhaustion, slumping into a chair as the silent control room erupted into tearful cheers and stunned relief. She had not just used the language, she had become its living instrument, and in that ultimate sacrifice, she had finally answered the plea the stones had carried for 1,000 years. The afternoon sun felt warm on her shoulders, a gentle weight after the crushing pressures of the past. Elara sat in the Foundation's garden, a quiet space where the hum of the city was a distant murmur, and the closer, softer hum of the stones was a familiar comfort. She watched Lynn and the other young listeners move among the raised beds, their hands not on charcoal and paper, but on living soil and flowering plants that seemed to pulse in time with the deep, resonant frequencies they cultivated. The world was safer now, not because the old dangers were gone, but because humanity had finally learned to listen to the ground beneath its feet. Her own reflection had shifted. The fire of obsession that had once driven her into dark places had banked into the steady glow of contentment. She was no longer the seeker clawing for validation, but the guardian ensuring the seeking would continue long after she was gone. The great, screaming message of the stones had been delivered, its cataclysmic warning heeded, and in its place remained a conversation. It was a dialogue built not on the frantic energy of survival, but on the patient, enduring foundation of mutual respect. The stones were quiet, their primary duty fulfilled, but their soft, constant hum was a promise that the story was not over. It was a story that would now be written by new hands, in a language of care, passed from one generation to the next, a shared future quietly growing in the sun.